Yeah, so let's go from money to free will. Let's see. So in terms of free will, I guess the first thing I would say is, this isn't something that I just woke up one day and was like, I'm going to debunk free will, right? It was like a convergence or confluence of all of these different things happening at the same time for me, and this all happened last year. So this is going on about a year now, where all this stuff has kind of been marinating and coming together, but. It was the confluence of what were really three different things. And I call the convergence of all these three different things my holy shit moment. And the reason I call it that is because this was bigger than an epiphany or an aha moment or a light bulb moment or whatever you want to call it. This was like, oh, wow, like in terms of like what people call consilience, which is like different disciplines coming together on the same conclusion independently. It was like these three things independently at the same time in my life were all pointing at the same thing and like, pay attention to this kind of thing. So in terms of what those three things were for me, the first was all things conceptual. So this goes back to the level of your mind and your psychology, but I had discovered the lottery of birth concept at this point. We can go into that or circle back to it if you want, but that was a big thing for me that was happening. At the same time, I had read Sam Harris's book, Free Will, which is a short little read, but does include some very simple thought experiments. So again, this is stuff you're thinking about. You're intellectually like thinking about these things, right? You're using logic and reason and trying to make sense of these different thought experiments. So all of this stuff was happening on the conceptual level for me. It was stuff that was marinating, stuff I was thinking about. So that's the first piece, was the conceptual. The second piece is what I call the experiential. So your lived experience of life and reality. And for me, this really is about psychological development. So at this point in my psychological development, I was at the point of at least being able to initially be able to take my mind as object, kind of see the inner workings of how my mind was working, how my thoughts were working, how my ego or identity was working. And that really gave me a newfound perspective on, well, if I'm not, if I'm able to observe that, then, and if I have awareness of that, then that's not fundamentally me, right? So what does that mean? And the same kind of thing happened with the lottery of birth stuff. I dissected my own lottery of birth and realized, oh, I didn't choose or control my nature, my nurture, all these things that shape the brain and mind that I end up with. I call that the strangest thing in life, which is the idea that you had 0% responsibility or control or choice over the brain and mind that you were dealt through just your birth and your conditioning and your socialization. Yet at some point in life, it's like a boiling of the frog in terms of like your own mind, where at some point it's flips, right? For everybody, where you had zero, I think everybody would say, or well, actually I've had some conversations where people aren't on board with this, but at least for me, the realization was I was not responsible for who my parents were, where I was born, the birth order that I had, my genetics, all these things, the education that my parents chose for me. Like, I didn't have any choice or control in any of those things, yet those shaped the brain and mind that I ended up with. And at some point, we flipped from being 0% responsible to thinking we're now 100% solely and individually and separate self responsible for whatever brain or mind we got through the lottery of birth. So all of this stuff was kind of happening for me at the same time. And then I was also diving deep into subject-object theory, which finally, for a number of years, it just never clicked with me. But then I read something from Robert Kegan's work. His theory of adult development has a subject-object theory in it. And this is a little bit of like word salad and a little hard to understand, but it finally clicked for me, where he says the subject of one stage of development becomes the object of the subject at the next stage of development. And once I was able to start to see the inner workings of my mind a little bit more, that made more sense to me. That finally clicked to me, because prior to that, you think you are your mind, right? You think you are your thoughts. You identify with, if someone attacks my ideas, they're attacking my identity. So prior to that, it's like a one and the same thing. And then finally, they kind of separate enough where you can start to take your mind as an object. So that was happening. And then the third piece of it is the scientific. So you've got the conceptual, the experiential, and then the third was the scientific, where I was diving deep into Robert Sapolsky's work on the biology of behavior. I was reading some stuff on neuroscience. I most recently just read David Eagleman's book, Livewired. So I was starting to learn not just the psychological or spiritual aspects, but also the biology underpinning everything that was happening, which, if anything, like that gives you a whole newfound respect on why life is the way it is, and it offers explanations that kind of make sense of things that we couldn't make sense of before. But all of those things were converging at the same time for me and led to this holy shit moment where I was like, well, what does all this mean for free will? if I didn't choose any of the stuff, like what do I even consider me? It's almost like a different way in on like Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry, asking who am I, from like a spiritual perspective. It's almost a different way in to that same thing, where it's more of like a conceptual and experiential approach from that perspective, where you're doing these thought experiments, you're having these realizations about yourself, you're able to see things a little bit differently because your lived experience of reality is different through psychological development. It's a different way in on it, but equally as impactful in terms of asking yourself, well, if I didn't choose all the things that led to me today in terms of what I consider me, quote unquote me, then what does that mean for me? Who am I if I didn't, like, can I take credit for anything, or can I take blame for anything? Because a lot of people have traumas that they grow up with as a child, and that has, in some cases, lifelong implications and downstream consequences. David Eagleman's book gave me a whole newfound respect on that. But it starts making you ask all these questions about free will. And in my personal experience of it has been liberating. A lot of people think it's limiting. So once you start to realize all these things impinging on your free will, or your lack of free will that you didn't realize before, it's like, oh, I'm really limited. And then, why do anything at all? Why does this even matter? All those types of questions. But I found it to be just extremely liberating in terms of, wow, like you start to have more compassion for yourself in terms of why you are the way you are. And of course, that translates interpersonally to how you interact with others. But the big thing about free will that people think is that it's like a belief that you hold in your mind. And what I've realized is that can lead you down, self-destructive paths or societally destructive paths. If you're just operating and acting or behaving based on a belief in your head, that is completely different than the lived reality or experience of the realization, the understanding, the seeing clearly of how life just seems to be working. So there's a huge difference there. It's not a belief that you hold in your head. The other piece is that a lot of people immediately go with free will to this like false dichotomy of, well, it's got to be free will or determinism. It's one or the other, right? And what I kind of have at least initially seen through this experience is that that's actually a false dichotomy. Determinism may be proven wrong, and even deterministic systems are unpredictable after a certain amount of time. So life is still unpredictable, regardless of free will or not. So you've got the false dichotomy piece, and then the other one is like people say, well, why does it matter if I have it or not? I'm just still going to do the same thing anyway. But my experience has just been the opposite in terms of it's well worth the time and energy to investigate. It gives you such a new perspective and liberating feeling about your life and life in general, and that it's well worth the time, and it matters way more than most people realize. So anyway, that was a long-winded explanation, but I feel like I've had enough conversations on Twitter about this topic that I understand that it's a touchy subject, and that a lot of this seems paradoxical or nonsensical. But yeah, I guess once you see it, it all seems much clearer at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting how I feel like this is what we're going really deep into, is free will. So from your perspective, there is no free will.
So this is kind of on like the bleeding edge of like the things that I've been thinking about, and even my lived experience of psychological development. I mean, the fact that we're both aware of Suzanne's work, it kind of gives you the idea, or we both are well aware that you can't see what you can't see if you're not at that stage of psychological development, right? Someone's lived experience. So for me, talking about someone like Ramana Maharshi or Jesus or someone who is truly enlightened, I can only understand that on the intellectual level at this point, but I feel like I understand enough of how it works, with subject-to-object merging, where you have a loss of sense of self, and you're just in a state of non-dual awareness. That all makes sense intellectually, right? Because if subject-object merge, there is no me, there are no others. Like Ramana Maharshi's quote of how should we treat others? There are no others. That all makes sense. Even Jesus's quote of forgive them, they know not what they do. In terms of psychological development, that makes a lot of sense now, right? It's like, yeah, like those people were in a different lived experience of reality at that stage of psychological development. And if Jesus was in a place of subject-object merging, that is completely different lived experience. But in terms of no free will, once you get to that spiritual side with Ramana Maharshi, he says, ask yourself who that question even arises to. So to whom does the question, do I have free will, even arise? And then, of course, that just leads you down the direct path of self-inquiry and all of that. But one subject-object merge, there's no one to ask the question. There's no one to answer the question. It's all one and the same. So from that perspective, there's certainly no free will. Actually, someone that you should have on the podcast, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. I just came across this guy's work. His name's Nicholas Latanzio. And he's working on a metaphysics called non-dual empiricism and embodied non-duality. I just did a synthesis on the site of it. But his work is really interesting, and because it aligns with so much of this current thinking that I'm going down in terms of, he says, on the non-dual level, there is no free will. But on the dual relative level, you've got your role that you're playing, but you now realize that you're playing your role. He kind of has this idea of you don't just stop at non-duality, you return to your role in life and you kind of act out your role, but it's not you living life, right? It's this idea that life is living you. Or what Ramana Maharshi says is like, God is the one doing all of it, you're the instrument through which God lives. So, we could probably talk about this all day, but what I'm going to do eventually, Robert Sapolsky has his book on free will coming out in October. I'm going to read that the day it comes out. And then after that, I think what I'm going to do, because I now I've somehow accumulated over 20 posts on the website about the lottery of birth and free will and all these kind of adjacent concepts. I'm going to turn all of those into an ebook after I read Sapolsky's book and kind of articulate my thoughts on everything at that point and ground it in my own lived experience, right? Because that's the big difference. That's how you don't get trapped in something like aboutism in ego development theory, where you're just intellectually just stewing on all this stuff. It's like, oh no, this stuff resonates because it is my lived reality, right? So.
Yeah. I'm glad I questioned you more on that, because I like what you said. Depending on from where you're at, from what perspective you're looking at it, that's why I like to say that, to me, free will is a paradox. In my own experience, I started to have this like years ago, where I was just like, I think free will is an illusion, and then I would really be like kind of entrenched in that view, and it wouldn't be it never was like nihilistic for me. It wasn't like, oh, now life is meaningful. It was also liberating, but then it would switch up, and then it would like, oh no, actually, when I would look at how I'm living my life, it actually feels like I do have free will. And it feels like I actually believe that there is free will based on how I'm operating, based on, oh, there's something to lose and there's something to gain. So when you talk about, and then, you brought in Ramana Maharshi and the fundamental inquiry question of who am I, which me and Andrew also were speaking about. And it's like, that is the question of free will, because once you dive deeply enough into the question of who am I, then even this question of free will dissolves.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And of course, so on one hand, you've got the spiritual side, right? And the Maharshi self-inquiry piece, and that is a certain path that you can go down. But equally important, I think, is the psychological and intellectual side, which can point you in that direction, at least. And once you get to that point of being able to take your mind as an object a little bit more, or at least see like the inner workings of how you're working to a certain degree, that is equally powerful, I feel like, because you're starting to get some of the insights, or at least those initial glimpses into questioning all your socialization conditioning. How did I ever become me in the first place? When did I become me? I can't think of a single point in my life where I'm like, okay, yeah, at this age or this level of psychological development or whatever, now I'm me kind of thing. So you have that boiling of the frog, but I agree with you in terms of none of this to me, when people hear this initially, or I have conversations with people about it, they say, oh, you must be, really nihilistic or fatalistic or believe in predetermination or determinism or all these things. And I'm like, none of those things have ever applied, actually. Like, I've never been fatalistic. I don't believe things are predetermined or see evidence for that. It's almost like life is happening and unfolding. And, it's like that idea that you're a wave in the ocean. You're not this separate thing from it, and the wave is happening. And instead of trying to control the wave, you're flowing as the wave or surfing the wave or whatever. but life is playing out, right? I feel like life is probably as surprised as we are as to however life unfolds or happens.